But before we start, I just wanted to introduce Laura, who's the founder of Supply Chain Insights. She's the author also as well of widely read enterprise software blog, Supply Chain Shaman, which has over 325,000 readers from the supply chain community. She is a LinkedIn influencer and a Forbes writer. She's written 11 books, so we have to be really proud of that. Supply chain management, including Bricks Matter and Metrics That Matter, but from 2012 and 2014, respectively. She holds a BS in chemical engineering, so near and dear to my heart, from the University of Tennessee and an MBA from the Wharton School of Business. And believe it or not, she enjoys gardening, quilting, and working on her next book. So she may claim not to be a book person, but I think she is. Laura, thank you very much for making the time today. It was a pleasure to sit with you last week and kind of walk through some of the prep for today. But it makes me really happy to have you here, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
It's my pleasure. It's my goal to be a great writer, and I write about 3,000 words a day. And, I'm a social scientist. So just to give you a little background, because I think it's good to know who you're talking to, I use my LinkedIn influencer group, which is now 345,000 followers globally, which I'm very honored to be, able to be followed by 345,000 people. So I create research studies and then I teach open content, and I use that to develop a research basis to understand how supply chains are changing, because the change in supply chain is sort of like the frog in boiling water. We have a lot of things happening, and a lot of times people don't realize that so much is happening that we really need to change processes. And so what I'm about is helping people to understand new technologies, the confluence of new technologies, the art of the possible, things like unstructured text mining, large language models, deep learning, reinforcement learning, as we look at agentics and agentic AI, and to think about supply chains holistically outside in. And so I enjoy writing for the business leader. There are lots of influencers that write for technologists, but I try to write for the business leader to understand what the value of process change and technology is all about. A little bit about my background. I'm an old gal, spent my early days in manufacturing, and then I wrote uh, for a research firm called Gartner. Gartner didn't care as much about supply chain as I did, so I went to a firm called AMR, and AMR got bought by Gartner, so I started my own firm. And I do publish ebooks every year based upon my writing, and I just love supply chain. So let's get into it. The supply chain over the last 3 decades that I've been an industry analyst has changed a lot. We built the global supply chain assuming that we would have available logistics, rational government policy, and low variability. And anyone in supply chain knows that these three assumptions have changed a lot. And as companies try to manage functional silos, so sourcing, purchase price variance, or manufacturing, OEE, or operational efficiency, or delivery, really looking at the lowest transportation cost. As we try to manage functional silos, we quickly learn that in this world of rising variability, that the efficient supply chain, or the lowest cost supply chain, particularly with the focus on functional cost, will never really be effective. And so the efficient supply chain, the lowest cost supply chain, is only really applicable for about 15% of volume in the supply chain. And I would allege that for the book industry, because you've got a lot of items, you've got the inability to forecast a lot of your items using traditional methods, that the efficient supply chain is really not the model that you should be looking at. You should be thinking more about how do you measure attributes and how do you translate attributes into effective plans? And what is the definition of supply chain excellence, which is looking at the alignment of our functions to be able to drive a successful supply chain strategy. So I'm going to spend a lot of my time this day on this simple model of what is supply chain and how should you think about it in the book industry. As I think about my clients in the book industry, and they think about the evolution of create, the whole process of content has changed considerably. We had the rise of social platforms and changes in reading. We had the evolution of open content sharing, and now we're really doing a dance of trying to figure out AI. And in Deliver, we had the evolution of the format, e-readers, and the rise of e-commerce, which radically changed how we got content. And we also had, you know, the influence of the freight recession. 3PLs went out of business. A lot of the small parcel manufacturers struggled. We had cybersecurity issues with our e-readers. And then as we think about make and self-publishing and industry consolidation, that is all creating a large variation and amplifying what I'm going to call the bullwhip effect. And as we think about sourcing, because the global supply chain has become less predictable and more variable and higher bullwhip, we have issues of constraints of materials, we have shortages of assets, and we're not very good at data sharing and helping people to understand how we should think about our processes. So a lot of my research is focused on how can we use market signals? How can we use the market signals from our customers and our channels? It's things like looking at attribute-based modeling and data sharing to be able to look at, what are the trends that are relevant? And I'm going to talk a lot about what is attribute-based modeling. So I'm going to get there. And data sharing, because I think those are really important for this industry. So as we think about market to market signals, we've got to think about what's happening in the channel. And we've also got to think about what's happening in our supplier network. And our focus on the evolution of supply chain needs to be on the effective supply chain, not the efficient supply chain, because this will never be the lowest cost. And how can I manage flow outside in, market to market, to be able to drive improvements in effectiveness? So when you think about planning, what are people going to buy? What should you make? What should you source? I want you to think about an attribute-based model, and you'll see this the most in apparel or luxury goods, where they never forecast the item. So they would never forecast a SKU or an item at a location. What they forecast are a set of attributes, 7 to 9. And so in the book industry, it might be the vehicle in which the content comes, whether it's a manuscript or an ebook. It might be the category, fiction, nonfiction, something like scholarly read, children's, the category. It might be the language, English, French, German. It might be the type of book, the type of read, something that maybe is on the coffee table or a paperback. And so as we think about attribute-based planning, that allows us to better manage the long tail of the supply chain, because as you have lots of items with a very low and lumpy demand, you'll never be effective in forecasting those at the item level. Instead, you've got to really forecast those at the attribute-based level and translate those attributes into sourcing strategies, things like specialized paper or specialized finishing, and to think about how do you translate those signals market to market. And my wish for this industry is that you could improve data sharing and that you could build a semantic reconciliation layer, which would allow you to take market data and to translate it semantically into these attribute-based models to improve data sharing. And I know, Ken, you went through a class with me, and this is easier said than done, but it's very different than a lot of traditional methods for forecasting. And I don't know if you have any content or thoughts to share at this point in time because you went through this training with me. Your thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, so um, we're in K-12 publishing, so we've got a little bit more lifetime to our products than many of the trade publishers that would be on the call. But we've been talking about looking at forecasting our paper tonnage requirements over time, the trim size, because the printers use different presses, and we actually use different printers for different kinds of books. So aggregating all of that stuff and looking at it and then sharing that information with the printers.
And so the attribute is the paper size or the paper
It,
quality content?
yeah, it's actually a few things. It's the trim size, so 5x8, 6x9, what have you. It's the paper grade because you have different kinds of grades for different kinds of books, and it's the binding style, like a hardcover versus a soft cover might be going to different companies. So it helps us figure out where we should go out for bid for these quantities of aggregated amounts of books, and who we should go to.
Now, Ken, I know when you came through my class, you had moved from an item-based forecasting kind of approach to looking at forecast value add for attributes. Can you tell the group a little bit about that learning?
Yeah, it is really difficult. If you just think statistically, if you're trying to forecast the fall list or the new titles, you never know which one's going to take off, which one's not going to take off. But when you start aggregating them together, the variance goes down and you get much more stable forecast. And to the extent that you can standardize your trim size and paper size, that allows you to even get more volume into that forecast and smooth things out.
Yeah, and the management of complexity, to your point, Ken, we've got to think about complexity like cholesterol. In the supply chain, we have good complexity, which helps us to sell more, and then we've got bad complexity, which is the increased variability that doesn't really add value to the customer. And so one of the things that I really push my students to do is to get rid of the complexity that doesn't add value. And one of the stories I tell is that, I worked with Campbell's, and Campbell's had 33 cuts of carrots in their soup, and who cares what size the carrot is, right? And they were able to minimize the cuts of the carrots down to 3, and they saved $5 billion. And so, in this world of sourcing constraints, the more that we can translate those attributes and minimize the bad complexity, the better we can move value into the supply chain. And the more that we can use our market signals, we can decrease the latency for us to react. And unfortunately, if we try to model based upon items, an item at a location, the demand latency or the time to sense the market shifts is really long. And so in the book industry, I see that it's sometimes 3 to 5 months. And I know, Ken, what did you actually measure as demand latency, the time to sense a market change and to know what's selling?
That was more problematic, and I still have not gotten to a great answer on this. In K-12, you have the adoption, and then the orders come through midsummer, and then you have to deliver. So the actual time frame between the order and delivery is pretty narrow compared to the lead time to get the books manufactured. We've also got huge seasonality. And on top of it, we've got this whole fixed manufacturing versus variable manufacturing cost that says buy as much as you can in one go as opposed to trying to set it out over time.
And so as you look at the maximization of commodity pricing and forward buying, it's really important that you look at sales and operations planning processes to be able to look at how can you maximize your sourcing spend based upon that market variability. But demand latency is the time from the purchase in the channel to see in an order. And that demand latency based upon some work that I did with the academic retailers, the folks that sell books at universities, that demand latency has been 4 to 5 months. And so the longer the demand latency, the time from the actual purchase at the shelf to the manufacturer, the distributor seeing the order is quite long in this industry. And as a result, as we think about the bullwhip effect, as we think about the purchase and the translation of the signal through the supply chain, the book supply chain has 8 to 10 times the industry average. And every time you translate that demand and you actually make a decision on that demand translation, you are amplifying and distorting the bullwhip effect. And so what happens is that creates waste and also creates outages in the supply chain. So my recommendation is don't focus on the efficient supply chain. Don't focus on the lowest cost. Really think about how can you move to attribute-based planning, use market signals, and try to divide your planning based upon the characteristics of those attributes. Certain attributes are very forecastable, certain ones are not. And if you don't have forecastable items, consider a make to order or a configure to order supply chain where maybe you try to postpone the finished goods. So maybe you buy paper and you wait to print it based upon the market signal. Attribute-based planning is used a lot in the apparel, the luxury good industry. So I would learn from them because they have a lot of items with very unpredictable seasonal demand. You would never want to adopt the planning practices of, say, a large consumer retailer like a Procter & Gamble or a BASF. They're just not a fit for this industry. And I know that AI causes a lot of confusion and perhaps disturbance in this industry and content creation, but I'm very excited about the confluence of technology to improve supply chains in the face of uncertainty and variability for planning and sensing and translation of data across networks. And I would encourage you to share data and try to minimize the bullwhip effect. So those are my thoughts today. And Ken, I don't know if we have any questions or discussion items from the group.
Yeah, there have been a few that have come in, and of course I've got a few as well.
Okay.
I'm not going to miss this opportunity. So does the bullwhip calculation suggest that book publishing could be 8 to 10% more effective, or sorry, 8 to 10 times more effective? Or do you think some of that is just it's just a characteristic of the book business and not really obtainable?
No, I think that it does. I think you've probably got 30 to 40% waste that you could actually reduce, as we look at the translation of demand. And I would encourage you to calculate that and see what it looks like for you. So absolutely.
There was in one of your columns, I think you pointed to someone who actually gave the formula for calculating it.
Yes.
And it's essentially the variance of the upstream demand versus the variance of what you're buying, right? And kind of dividing
Correct.
the two or something. Yeah.
And there are modeling techniques in the market today that allow you to measure this. If you look at a company like Lyric, or you look at, a couple of other companies that allow you to do desktop modeling, which would allow you to actually calculate for a particular industry what that business opportunity is. And bullwhip effect, the greater your complexity, the bad complexity, the less sophistication you have in planning, the greater the bullwhip effect. And the way to really reduce it is to use market signals and decrease that latency, improve data sharing, and to focus on the attributes of what's driving the channel.
It seems like this would be useful for editorial if they could get there by looking at, we want to focus in XYZ genre.
Correct.
And we want to push out so much, and then people could count on, the retailers could count on that. That's a pretty different perspective than editors generally have.
I agree. Most editors want to look at a particular book.
That's
But,
right.
in the attribute-based planning, what you're looking at is the experience of what kind of category, what kind of vehicle are people actually using, and how do I basically move my portfolio based upon that demand profile?
So, are there models for how to foster data sharing in an industry that doesn't do it very well, like us? Are there data points that have an immediate benefit?
Yes. So if you look at data sharing, the best data sharing platforms actually happened where you have very low margins. So the chemical industry has probably the best data sharing. If you go and fill up your car with gas, and let's say you go to a Chevron, it may be that Exxon actually delivered to that Chevron. They actually share data, and they will basically be very flexible about the delivery based upon grade, because when you crack oil, you're never really able to control those downstream ingredients. So they do data sharing, and they also do shared fulfillment. Now, another industry that does data sharing really well is aerospace and defense. And both of these industries have networks for you to look at and to think about. In aerospace and defense, the constraint is labor that is knowledgeable and has a security clearance. So the security clearance is the constraint. So in the aerospace and defense industry, where you're sharing engineering documents and you're looking at quality of conformance to quality design, and you're looking at the security clearance as a constraint, they are very good at data sharing. And so the chemical industry and the A&D industry is where I would look.
Kathy Felgar from Princeton has a question about what segment do the market signals come from, like customer, retailer, et cetera?
They come from all segments. And so, one of the advantages of our new forms of technologies is we can build a semantic reconciliation layer that allows us to actually translate the differences in the retail signal of what's happening on the retail shelf to the wholesale distributor to the manufacturing order. And that semantic reconciliation layer is really what's very exciting. And I don't want to bore you, but it comes from building ontological frameworks that allow us to do that semantic reconciliation. And this ontologies are really based upon natural language. And so I would encourage you, and if you want to contact me for people that do this well, I would be glad to connect you. And to me,
Um,
that's what's really exciting about the evolution of deep learning, reinforcement learning, and the building of networks with the semantic reconciliation.
um, Peter has a question. We've been kind of talking about things that are really easy to see applied to genre publishing, like romance and mystery and so on. But he's asking, how would you think about it with like unique authors and literary fiction, where there's not a lot in common among the different books?
I would say maybe you need a configure to order or a make to order supply chain versus make to stock. And what you would do is you would basically make an order and sell it through the market. So that's how it does. And then do your next order versus a make to stock supply chain where you make a lot and flow it through. Or, you know, you sense, sometimes you can test and learn with supply chains. So you could make perhaps an ebook version of it and put it in an e-commerce retailer and test and learn how it sells in that channel, and then ascribe that experience to another channel. So I'll tell you a story. I worked with a retailer and a manufacturer of men's underwear. And they were concerned that their underwear was bought by older men. Their average buyer was 55 years old, and younger men don't buy as much underwear as a younger man. So they basically use their e-commerce channel to test and learn based upon packaging and color and price point. And then they use that data to actually say what should they put in the retail stores, the end caps for Macy's or, the traditional mall stores. And we can learn cross-channel about, what's happening around packaging and attributes and price point. And that also might be a chance to use your supply chain as a test and learn vehicle.
I think I remember hearing about a company in the UK that was gauging the popularity of future books by making the advanced reader copies available and then seeing how those moved.
Yes.
So that might be an example of what you're talking about here.
Right. And also market signals. So, for example, the Happy Meals at McDonald's are highly correlated to, what's happening on box office sales. And, the sale of dishwashers is closely coupled to the divorce rate. So, sometimes we can look at market signals that may not seem, to connect, and they actually do. And so, we have to continually look at what is the cause and effect and how can we use our supply chains to test and learn.
Matt, you put a fairly large question into chat. Do you want to come off mute and ask?
Sure. I was just trying to see if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. These attributes, are you trying to group together SKUs essentially, take it away from an ISBN level and look at, say, all your 6x9 paperbacks or those types of general things and look at what's my total, demand for that type of product and be able to wait till the last minute to actually decide, okay, how many of this one do I need? How many of that one do I need when you're trying to build out this type of a supply chain?
So what you're trying to do, thank you for the clarity. In the tactical horizon outside of lead time, when you're buying materials, let's say you're buying paper, or maybe you're contracting for binding, in that tactical horizon, which is your long-term horizon outside of lead time. So I'm thinking a book has a lead time of 6 to 9 months. In that long-term horizon, you're actually taking your attributes. So you're right. So it might be the size of paperbacks. Let me use the apparel industry as an example. When the apparel industry works with suppliers, they don't tell them SKU, which for you as an ISBN, they say that they need so many 8.5 wide tie shoes that are used for running, or they have, this many 6 narrow high heels in leather. And that helps to translate the requirements for your constraint-based suppliers and also for you to think about warehouse and distribution. If you try to forecast at an item level or an ISBN level, because of the volatility and the uncertainty in the industry, you will translate uncertainty and create noise. And the way that you improve the forecast in attribute-based planning is in that tactical horizon outside of lead time, you hold yourself accountable for forecast value add, which is a little more complicated than we're going to go through here, but I can definitely share the methodology of how to do that. And I worked with Ken on that, and it's a journey, but I think it's a very worthwhile journey. Did I answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So Martha had an interesting point. She's considering things like pre-orders, comparative sales data on like similar titles,
Yep.
customer orders, rep estimates. Do those count as market signals?
Absolutely. Those are great market signals. And so as you think about traditional models, we used to have single if to single then. So we would have perhaps sales translate through an optimization engine to give us a forecast. Then in our evolution of planning, we can have 20 kinds of inputs. So all the ones that Martha's talking about plus more. So for example, when I forecast in the agricultural industry, I'm looking at the number of hectares planted, I'm looking at weather, I'm looking at moisture in the soil, perhaps I'm taking pictures of the crops as they're being harvested, perhaps I'm looking at government subsidies. And so the evolution of the models in reinforcement learning allows us to use multiple inputs to be able to do that translation. So Martha, I welcome you to do that because that's where the fun is.
I'm not going to subject you to all of the idle chatter about or idle banter about underwear that has now gone into the
Well,
chat. But Ariel has a really interesting point. If you think about like genre and trim size and
yes,
fantasy, all of these different attributes,
yes,
they can all kind of triangulate correctly to
correct.
come up with, and you're reconciling across all of them to get
That's
the
correct.
view. Yes,
Right.
very good.
And that's what is important is the dialogue on the reader experience. And how is that reader experience changing with what's happening in the channel, what's happening in the delivery, what's happening in interest? And I'm an avid reader. I spent my childhood reading, day to day. Reading is not something people have the same kind of affinity for these days, right? They're interested in more short reads. And, social media has, and our devices have taken a lot of the reading experience and changed it. So as we think about that reading experience and we think about how we serve the channel, this market translation through new forms of technology offers the book industry great opportunity.
Peter's got an interesting point. And I think I have an answer for this, but I'm curious to hear yours. His assertion is that our distribution lead time is more like 9 to 14 months, which he acknowledges is, and in his opinion, is way too long. And with the social media and the quick drive of like customer demand, that's just out of any kind of reasonable time frame. Are there any ways that you can think of to like reduce this amount of time?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I could not believe how long it took me to write a book and the laborious processes of book writing and the laborious processes of creating a manuscript. And so as we think about this create function of, I'm not for AI creating content, but I love, the content generating tools that help me with the Chicago Style Guide and help me to, make sure that my manuscript when I do e-publishing is clean. That process was like a root canal when I was, writing a book. I used to laugh that it was like, delivering a child and only one woman can deliver a baby. And, so somehow, this whole content creation can change dramatically. In addition, as we think about large language models and we think about the delivery of content, there's a whole new world opening up there. And so, I would get in front of it. And I think we could dramatically change how quickly we could turn around books.
Many of the trade publishers are really allergic to any mention of AI
I
because
know.
of the copyright issues mostly.
I understand.
Could you talk about some of the kind of non-copyright opportunities for AI in both the content creation as well as the physical supply chain?
Let's start with the supply chain. I
Yeah.
know that you probably itch when I say AI, and I want you to think about it as an enabler for the supply chain. So this whole semantic reconciliation level, I want you to list all the potential market drivers, price, returns, first interest, whatever your market drivers are. And they're probably going to be 50 to 100, and you probably don't know how to make sense of them. You can build an ontological framework that's a learning framework on all of those items, and you can do it pretty quickly for, less than $5,000. And then that semantic reconciliation learning model off of all those market drivers can translate demand with less distortion on the bullwhip. That is a tremendous opportunity for you. Then you can do reinforcement learning. And I'm not saying that you take people out of the process. What you're doing is you're driving insights for the business leaders to get data at the speed of business. And the old-fashioned planning world, I had to ask a planner, and that took time, and people used Excel spreadsheets. You will never forecast this book industry on an Excel spreadsheet. But this whole use of unstructured data, rating and review data, comments, image data gives us great opportunity to sense data faster, use data at the speed of business, and decrease the bullwhip effect. And that is, I think, a great opportunity for you. I don't know, Ken, did I help you?
You did. One of the things that is remarkable when you look at the process flow of taking a book to market, one of the big chunks in there isn't actually processing the book and the manuscript. It's the marketing lead time with retailers to make sure that there's a big launch and everybody knows about it when it eventually lands. And so I've been on the wrong end of conversations about, we can do this a lot faster. And it's like, but we need more time to get to our retailers.
Well, one of the case studies that I use in my class is BSH, and BSH makes appliances. And, a dishwasher is really a fashion item. It's, what color's my kitchen, how quickly am I going to load it and unload it. And so what happened is bad complexity in the white goods market, where they had a long tail of the supply chain and they couldn't really translate market needs. And things were bumping along pretty well until we had COVID. And then we had a spike in demand because people couldn't eat out and take their trips to Cancun, and they were redoing their kitchens. And BSH started looking hard at what were the market drivers that caused people to either redo their kitchens or to buy a dishwasher and a refrigerator. And we looked at a lot of things like GDP, and we looked at COVID rates and sewage, and we looked at sales at, the retail box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's to decrease that demand latency and to build these attribute-based models. So, an attribute-based model for dishwashers is, what is the outside? Is it stainless steel? Do I put something on it? What is the pump size? What is the size of the cabinet? And what were the factors by region? And we built the models of, 15 to 20 items. And it was amazing. They shorted the market going into COVID because they couldn't get enough pumps for the dishwashers, but they have dramatically improved their ability to align manufacturing in a volatile world and a fashion-based industry. And so I think it's a good case study for you guys to think about and, network with other people in the fashion industry. And you may not think about things like faucets and dishwashers as fashion items, but they have become fashion items. And think about how you can ascribe these processes into what you do.
I'm thinking a little bit of Open Road Media that has massive lists of people that are interested in particular kinds of books.
Yes.
And they push those, once they license the books, they push that to their list.
Yes.
And presumably they get a pretty consistent, percentage sale, which is really kind of flips it into looking at who's buying as opposed to who's writing. So that might be
And
an
I think
example.
that's an important shift to focus not on who's writing, but who's buying and what are they buying and why are they buying? And, how do I get in front of the market so that the long tail of the supply chain doesn't whip me?
Do you have any thoughts about how an organization like Book Industry Study Group might promote this way of thinking about the world, or like what would our role be in doing this?
I'd love to see you build an ontological framework and teach people how to do it. I would welcome you to, basically start with a business problem of something that you're trying to forecast that's hard and to, start to, you know, build an ontological framework that helps you with that semantic reconciliation layer for demand translation so you understand it and then adopt these practices in the book industry.
Now, would any of your columns or your upcoming book have examples about like how people did this so we could like take it and like try this?
Well, that's actually the book that I'm writing. I
Yes.
haven't found an author or a publisher that will let me publish it, but what I'm working on are case studies. And so I'm actually going to launch a large language model that has agentics on top of the large language model to look at performance benchmarking. And, I want to increase the case studies of using market signals. So, yeah, I don't have a publisher yet, but that's what I want to write about.
Well, you're talking to a lot of publishers right now, so that
Awesome.
might be a good way to go.
Yeah.
Um, okay, Matt, you had another point. You want to jump in on this?
You'll have to tell me about the underwear comments. They actually grew market share by about 15% and improved revenue because they were able to better forecast what the younger man was buying in underwear. It's a great
Well,
case study.
this was more earthy, like
Okay, all right, okay.
why young men don't buy underwear, and on and on and on. But Matt,
But
bring us
people will
back.
remember my story, right?
They will certainly do that.
Yeah,
There you go. So yeah, it sounds like what I'm hearing you kind of advocating for is that, having looking at the publishing industry and supply chain, that there's a real opportunity from a data sharing standpoint to
yes,
help the supply chain kind of form itself around uh, different attributes of demand that needs to be filled, and so
yes,
you're much more responsive as opposed to relying on data that's backward looking and may no longer be relevant.
correct.
And
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's the tricky part is just I think the number of variables that is one of the first things that I think flusters people. But what were you gonna say, Ken?
I was going to look at the score. I'm just going to change the subject. I was looking at the Laura's framework here, which is reminiscent of score, but it's got create in there, which is a little different, and the sequence is a little different. Is this like a combination of like design chain and supply chain?
Yeah, I would recommend that you take the ASM work on design and supply chain and you think about building a model for the book industry of how do you embrace new technologies to be able to do this, to, look at attribute-based semantic reconciliation and how can you use these multiple market signals. So help people to think about market signals differently and to think about the supply chain as a learning mechanism for the book industry. And then how do you build, this ontological semantic reconciliation layer to move demand with less latency in a meaningful way across parties? And that is the beauty of what is happening in the supply chain today. And there are not a lot of people that can help you, but I could connect you with people that are working on these models that you could build something that would allow you to teach your trading partners what the value of this is and measure the bullwhip effect and measure the distortion and the waste. Take an ugly supply chain where you're not doing very well, that's hard to forecast, and maybe you throw a lot of books away or you have a lot of returns, and do a sharing session where maybe you work on what this could look like and share it for the industry.
Scott, you mentioned something interesting here. Do you want to come off mute and share it with everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I've not spoken in the group before, but AI is something the company I work for are very interested in. Right now, we sell academic textbooks in the market, largely online. And we've recently acquired a small solution, an app that enables students to upload data from the college course they're studying to an environment where they can then create things like learning tools, flashcards, that kind of thing, right? And we're figuring out how we could then use AI to connect those students to the content that the publishers provide in more of an a la carte way. So
right.
book has always been packaged, in a beautiful cover. I've been in the industry for about 40 years now, and I've loved the covers I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
They're gorgeous things. But I think getting used to the idea that maybe people want snippets from those books, something we've always said would happen with ebooks, but never really happened.
Right.
That AI will create. And if we don't create it ourselves from within the industry, I do fear that AI organizations that have already started collecting our data, either with our cooperation or maybe without our cooperation, they will figure out where the demand is, and they will figure out a way of getting that information to that customer. So I think it's just an interesting area that we're looking at very closely, because we sell lots and lots of books, academic textbooks every year, physical books, and we're trying to figure out where the next play for us is.
I think that's a really important thing to think about. I'm an old gal and I've spent 20 years building content, and I don't want my content to be distorted in Chat GPT. And so I'm building my own large language model, and on top of it, I'm putting the data that I've collected from the supply chain to admire, which is 15 years of looking at which supply chains perform the best. And I am getting those supply chain leaders that perform the best to answer a set of research questions that will allow benchmarking and allow people to connect directly to my research. I am not going to let my content, be at the discretion of ChatGPT that does not have the intellectual horsepower to understand supply chain. And likewise, I think you have the opportunity to look at large language models and agentics and look at what are students actually using in the right way, and how can you deliver tools and platforms that allow communication and bidirectional orchestration to change that reading experience. And I agree, it didn't happen with the readers, right? The readers are still one way, but it's a great discussion for you to have. And, I'd love to share what I'm learning in the large language model with use of agentics as I roll it out. So it might be interesting for you.
Well, you actually have rolled out Talk to Lora. I don't know what it's called, but I've used it and had conversations with your digital alter ego.
Yeah, so it's called Ask Lora, which
Okay.
is sitting on top of the content I've created. But what I'm rolling out is agentics on top of that, which basically, when you enter Ask Lora, it'll say, who are you and what do you consider your peer group? And, it will reference the Y chart data, which is the content on performance, which is all the scrub public reporting. And then I have these research questionnaires, which basically allow me to look at how mature are they in organizational design? How aligned are they? how well are their planning processes honed? And then I ask the same questions of the Supply Chain Stoudemire Award winners, which allow them to see the general population and then the people that do it well, so that I can build a learning environment. And so you've got the opportunity, I think, with all your content to redefine the experience. So I'm just telling you what I'm doing. It's fascinating what's happening in the world of technology.
That is fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing the new book when it comes out, as well as the evolution of Ask Laura.
Well, the new book is, longer on the horizon because, I'm still working on the case studies. But Ask Laura will actually come out in March, and, I'd be glad to share that experience.
Well, we'll make sure to circulate it widely among the publishers who might well be one of your future publishers. So,
yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
All right. We're getting close to the end of the hour here. Are there any other questions that folks asked that I didn't echo appropriately, or comments that anyone would like to make?
I was just wanting to just ask whether, you feel like this can be, the industry should approach this on a macro level, or, whether this type of research is best done, with a subset of companies, and then you're sharing that research. I guess how have other industries approached, taking a first step into this?
It's a great question. The most success has happened where the relationships are the strongest and the ability to win together are the most assured. And so as you think about the oil industry, they had a shared problem where when they cracked oil, they couldn't predict the downstream fractionation. It also happens in the medical industry, when you basically do the reverse orchestration of blood. You have, only a person can give blood. And so it's a constraint, and there are 22 attributes in blood. And so when we're actually working on collaboration in the medical industry, we have a high need for patients, and we've got a type blood for O positive, AB, and whether we're going to have plasma or red blood cells. And so that sharing in the American Red Cross is actually a good model. So the models that are the most successful is you've got a clear need and a win-win value proposition of relationships that are necessary. And you've got the willingness to test new methods. And, so when you think about the book industry, I wouldn't go willy-nilly. I would look at where do you have the strong relationships and the strong need, and how can you build a model that then others can learn from? So, for example, BASF and Evonik created a really strong relationship. The oil companies created a strong relationship. The blood supply created a strong relationship. I don't know where that is in the book industry. To me, it seems like you've got a lot of adversarial relationships, and that's just from the outside working with customers. I don't know where the win-win relationships are, but I would start there, Matt. Does that help?
That helps a ton. No, thank you so much. This has been
Yeah.
super helpful.
And if you want to talk more, I've put my email at the back, and hopefully you'll remember my studies of carrots and, men's underwear. I just share those so that, you can learn from other industries. But send me an email, and I'd be glad to talk to you about things that people are working on and how you might do some pilots.
Appreciate it, Laura.
And that is a great way to wrap us up. Laura, thank you so much for attending and explaining your work over all the years and what you're thinking about right now. You've certainly given us a lot to consider and to take action on. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope it helps. And contact me anytime. Follow me on LinkedIn, and hopefully somebody out there will crack the code on the book industry, because it is not easy. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye now.